The next item of business is debate on motion 21170 in the name of Ben Macpherson on the Local Government Finance Scotland Order 2020. Would those members who wish to speak in the debate please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Ben Macpherson to speak to and move the motion for up to 7 minutes, please, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The purpose of today's debate on the Local Government Finance Order is to seek Parliament's approval to the guaranteed allocations of revenue funding to individual local authorities for 2020-21. It also seeks agreement to the allocation of additional funding for 2019-20, which has been identified since the 2019 order was approved this time last year. The delay to the UK budget means that we still do not know the total budget available to Scotland next year. Therefore, we have had to make assumptions around Barnett consequentials, use provisional economic forecasts and take forward decisions on devolved tax policy without knowledge of future UK tax policy. That position is not of our choosing and creates unnecessary challenges. Presiding Officer, under challenging circumstances, the 2020-21 budget delivers a fair settlement for local government. The funding package in 2020-21 provides local government with a real terms increase in both revenue and overall funding to invest in our pounds. This includes revenue funding of £10.7 billion and support for capital expenditure of £778 million. Today's order seeks Parliament's approval for the distribution and payment of £9.9 billion out of the revenue total of £10.7 billion. This £9.9 billion is a combination of general revenue grant of £7.1 billion and the distributable amount of non-domestic rates income, which has been set at £2.8 billion. The Scottish Government continues to guarantee each local authority the combined general revenue grant plus non-domestic rate income. This means that any loss of non-domestic rate income resulting from the adverse impact of Brexit or COVID-19 will also be compensated for by increased general revenue grant. For clarity, the remainder of the funding package will be paid out as specific grant funding or other funding, which will be distributed later in year once agreed with COSLA. The overall funding package for... Yes, we have to take an intervention.
Andy Whiteman.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for taking an intervention. Can he clarify that the additional £95 million of revenue funding secured in the budget deal with the Scottish Green Party that does not appear to be in this order, given that the individual figures for each local authority are the same as Annex L of the settlement letter sent on 6th of February, can he clarify where that £95 million is being allocated and when?
Ben Macpherson.
I was a very timious intervention, Mr Whiteman, thank you, and because I was about to say the overall funding package for 2020-21 includes an additional £95 million revenue funding to further support spending on day-to-day services, as announced on the 27th of February as part of the Stage 1 of the Budget Bill. £100 million for investment in health and social care and mental health services delegated to integration authorities, provision of £156 million for the Teachers' Pay Award and £97 million for teachers' pensions. £201 million of revenue and £121 million of capital to support the expansion of early years education and childcare to 1,140 hours by August 2020. Also, £88 million to maintain the pupil-teacher ratio and secure places for all probationers who require one, and the flexibility for local authorities to increase council tax levels by up to 3% in real terms, worth an estimated £135 million. Keen to make some progress, thanks. The 2020-21 settlement from the Scottish Government now provides local government with an increase in spending for local revenue services of £589 million or 5.8%. Taken together with the potential to raise council tax income, councils had access of up to a total increase of £724 million, or 7.2% in spending power to support local authority services. All local authorities have now set their income tax levels for next year, and it should be noted that had all councils taken up the opportunity to increase council tax revenue by 3% in real terms, a further £8.3 million would have been available for local services. Clearly, those councils who have not taken up their full council tax flexibility consider they have a fair settlement. Presiding Officer, there remains a further £51.9 million of revenue funding that will be distributed once the necessary information becomes available and will be included for approval in the 2021 order. The amounts involved, as agreed with local government, are as follows. £37.6 million in respect of the 2020-21 Teachers Induction Scheme, £11.9 million in respect of the balance of the discretionary housing payments, £0.5 million in respect of mental health school counselling services, £0.4 million in respect of implementing the Barclay Review of non-domestic rates, and £1.4 million in terms of the Customer First top-up. In addition to the revenue funding contained within today's order, there is specific revenue funding that is paid directly by the relevant policy areas under separate legislation amounting to £709.7 million, including £120 million of pupil equity funding, £86.5 million for criminal justice social work funding, £487.3 million of funding for early years expansion, £11.5 million of additional support for Northern Ferries, and £4.4 million of Gaelic funding. Lastly, Presiding Officer, the 2019 order also seeks approval for changes to funding allocations for 2019-20 of £327.3 million, which have been added to fund a number of agreed spending commitments. The full list of changes can be found in the report to the 2020 order. And these include £141 million for teachers' pay, £60.1 million for teachers' pensions, £37.5 million to support the 2019-20 Teachers Induction Scheme, £29.5 million for free personal care for the under-65s, £15 million for additional support for learning, £12 million to provide counselling services in schools, and £2.1 million to allow free access to sanitary products in our schools. In summary, Presiding Officer, the total funding from the Scottish Government to local government next year amounts to £11.4 billion. These funding proposals continue to deliver a fair financial settlement for our partners in local government, which will be strengthened by continued joint working to improve outcomes through first-class public services. Presiding Officer, I move that Parliament approves the Local Government Finance Scotland Order for 2020. Thank you.
Now call on Graham Simpson for up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm very grateful. If I could just start, I was going to intervene on the Minister because I didn't think he fully answered Mr. Whiteman's question. Perhaps he may wish to return to it, because the question was, where does that extra £95 million appear in the order? So if it doesn't appear, it doesn't appear. I think the Minister may want to reflect on his response. Now, this is a technical debate, really. This is about giving the money that local government needs to local government, and it would be remiss of us not to support the motion on that basis, because clearly local government needs to be funded. That doesn't mean that we have to like the settlement, but settlement it is, and we need to pass that money to councils so that they can provide the services. And indeed, we don't like the settlement. We have spoken in the past 2 weeks in various budget debates about what we think about it. We think that this year's settlement, like last year's, and the year before that, and the year before that, and so on, is not proper or fair funding. And I recall last year at the Local Government Committee, when I had a bit of a debate with the predecessor to Kate Forbes and Miss Forbes herself about what is the definition of fair. And my view was that if all councils in Scotland are having to make cuts, that is hardly fair. And that's the position, yes?
John Mason.
I thank the member very much for giving way. I agree with him that defining fair is not always easy. Does he think, therefore, that the NHS has had too much money and he would cut that to give more to local government?
Graham Simpson.
I always regret letting Mr Mason in because he makes the most obscure points in a debate about local government funding. Is he saying that this settlement is fair? I don't think it is. Well, we may as well let him in as well.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank Mr Simpson for taking intervention. Is Mr Simpson seriously saying to the Chamber and this Parliament that even prior to this Parliament, when the Conservatives were in power in London, that no cuts ever took place to local authority budgets in Scotland?
Graham Simpson.
I'm not saying that at all. I'm dealing with the budget in front of us today, the settlement in front of us today, which delivers cuts to every single one of Scotland's 32 councils. And that's not fair. And that has left councils on the brink, as a series of leading councillors have said in the past few weeks. COSLA's president, Alison Everson, Stephen Heddle, my good friend, Councillor Gail McGregor, who leads on finance for COSLA, all across the political spectrum. And you may even have the odd SNP council leader who privately don't like what's going on. So Scotland's council leaders were disappointed. And now here Mr Lyle chuntering away, as he often does. But if he's got anything worthwhile to say, let's hear it, and I'll let him in, rather than his usual "oh" from the sedentary position. If Mr Lyle has something positive to say, he can say it. Pay as he doesn't. Now, council leader after council leader have said this fails to make any restoration of the significant cuts to local government core funding in previous years. They said it represents a 2% or £2.5 million cut in real terms in revenue funding for local government. And they said an extra 2% funding for inflationary pressures and 3% for restoration of previous funding cuts, or for restoration of the £117 million cut to capital allocation is needed. That's what's needed, and that's what this settlement does not do. Now, I've taken a couple of interventions so far. I was hoping Mr Lyle would intervene, but he hasn't. So we have a situation where revenue cuts are going down. It's going to take £300 million just to stand still, and that's not being delivered. Now, proper funding of councils matters. It matters when you want to tackle child poverty, for example. And here he is, Mr Lyle. We've got him.
A quick one, please. Yeah. Richard Lyle.
Would the member agree with me that the Tories, and thank you for taking the intervention, Mr Simpson, would the member agree with me that the Tory party has cut severely councils in England, more than what Scotland councils have had to suffer?
Graham Simpson.
My word, we have the old English excuse. This is the Scottish Parliament. And in the Scottish Parliament, we are cutting councils, we're cutting money to Scottish councils. I would have thought Mr Lyle, who represents North Lanarkshire, would have been concerned about that. He should be jumping up and down about what's happening in North Lanarkshire, not what's happening in England. He seems to be more concerned about what's going on over the border than on his own doorstep. What a position that is. Mr Lyle needs to explain to his constituents why he's taking that view. What an absurd position. Now, COSLA's Children and Young People spokesman...
Could we calm down a wee moment? And Mr Simpson, could you come to a close fairly soon?
I certainly will. I'd be delighted to come to a close. This settlement does not add up for local government. It leads to cuts across the board. But they need the money, so we'll support it begrudgingly.
Now call Sarah Boyack for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Having given councils a third of the money they need to deliver Scottish Government promises and carry out their obligations and provide the services their communities need, this local government settlement is nothing to celebrate. I want to make 3 points. The reality of the disproportionate cuts to local government by the SNP, the increased control over the money that local government is allocated, and the impact on our communities and our constituents. Spice have noted that since 2013 to 14, the Scottish budget allocation from the UK Government has increased by 2.6%, yet the Scottish Government has reduced allocations to local government by 3.8%. And as I observed in our main budget debate, this settlement falls against a backdrop of almost £900 million of cuts to non-ring-fenced revenue funding since 2013-14. The loss of 10,000 full-time equivalent jobs, which translates into 33,000 redundancies, a slashed capital budget, leaving councils to borrow for funding vital projects, taking that money out of their revenue spend, and curtailed services hitting those who need them. Now, last week, SNP ministers made great play of their no tax increases for people on low and middle incomes. But they've passed on the difficult decisions to local councils. Grappling with gross underfunding, councils are having to use the levers they have available to them to balance the books, raising council tax and increasing charges for services. We have long argued, and the SNP, I understand, have recognised the regressive nature of council tax, which hits those least able to pay the most. Even the relief schemes, even after those relief schemes, data from Spice has shown that those on the lowest 10% of earners pay 17% of their income in council tax, compared to 1.5% of income for those in the top 10%. And if you add on to that increased charges for services councils provide, lower income households are being priced out of services they are already struggling to access. There's also the issue of comparing local government funding this year with last year. A reduction in capital, but an increase in ring-fenced capital allocations. A reduction in the general revenue grant, but an increase in specific resource grants. Now, the Minister told us today that COSLA has agreed with the decisions to ring-fence core expenditure. But I believe that this year the Scottish Government has gone too far. In the days before this Parliament, we used to have a Scottish administration. Its policy and funding set at a UK level. What an irony. We now have a Scottish Government which increasingly is turning local government into local administration. It leaves the Scottish Government... Yes, I'd be delighted to take an intervention.
James Dornan.
Will the member recognise that in terms of ring fencing, there's much less ring fencing going on now than there was under the previous government in this Parliament, and that was a Labour and Lib Dem government?
Sarah Boyack.
Sorry, I just would make the point that that was at a point where the money was being doubled through Gordon Brown's interventions. We're talking about a reverse in approach here. We've now got a Scottish Government which is turning our local government colleagues into administrators, leaving them all the tough decisions. It does give the Scottish Government little pots of money to allocate throughout the year, which is much better for photo ops. But it's our constituents who suffer, and we need to pay attention to the human story behind all of this. Take social care as just one critical example of council services facing cuts. I want to share the struggle of one of my constituents, trying to get a basic care package to enable them to go about their daily life. This constituent was assessed as having a care need in May last year. They came to me for help in November. I have just found out in this week that there is still not any appropriate care and support being offered, with no agency to provide the care and not even basic safety measures installed. A case riddled with lack of resources, high staff turnover, demonstrating the crisis in social care in our local authorities. And that is not just that one case. We know from statistics that is widespread. The cuts to local government are now so severe that even statutory services such as care and education are at a breaking point and under huge pressure. And that's the human cost of underfunding local government. Waiting 6 months for a care package is unacceptable, no matter how this government spins it. And the pressure of staff trying to ration, to trying to provide services when we know we have people having to take sick leave is just not acceptable. It's clear from this statement we have in front of us today this order that our local councils do not have the resources they need. In the long term, lack of investment in our communities ultimately costs all of us. It increases poverty. It undermines our communities. It's time for change. What we need is bold, transformative policies to deliver real results, create jobs, end poverty, and tackle climate change. Sadly, this is not what this order is about today.
Andy Whiteman, 4 minutes, please.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. As members have already indicated, this is an important debate today, allocating over £9.8 billion to local government, and an hour barely does it justice. But nevertheless, as members know from my previous contributions, Greens believe it's fundamentally better for us all if decisions about local authorities' finances are taken by the people who care most about that local authority, that is, by the people living in that local authority. And alert members will recognise that turn of phrase from the Yes campaign in the 2014 independence referendum, and what's argued by some to be a right for Scotland should also be a right, we believe, for local authorities. And thus it's a matter of regret that so much of the capital and revenue allocations for councils continues to be determined by this Parliament. However, while that is the case, however, Greens will and have done all they can to ensure that the funding settlement is adequate, and have secured hundreds of millions of pounds in extra revenue over the past few years. But I freely admit that this is not the settlement that we in government we'd seek to secure. For one thing, despite the historic decline in ring fencing, as just been debated, the financial settlement continues to be bedevilled by ring fencing, and indeed by terms such as protected funds that are still not actually very clear and compromise the scrutiny that we in the Local Government Committee have been able to make of this budget. And that's true to the extent that this year's additional commitments were not even fully funded, despite a government commitment to that effect, which is why filling the 95 million hole was an important achievement in this year's budget. And I'll be grateful if the Minister could provide extra clarity in his closing remarks as to when that 95 million will be delivered, why it's not in the order. This order was laid on the 19th of February, as I understand it. We had a stage 1 debate on the budget on the 27th of February, at which we reached agreement on that quantum of 95 million. Now, despite differences of opinion, and they exist, on the sums of money outlined in this order, we should all vote for it tonight, because it does provide the legal basis on which the Scottish Government can transfer sums of money, substantial sums of money, to councils who rely on it to deliver vital public services. Now, the decisions on how this money is spent, of course, are made by councils. And one of the interesting things in recent years, following on from a Green initiative in Edinburgh Council, is that citizens now have the opportunity not only to scrutinise council budgets, but also to be actually actively involved in the process through participatory budgeting. By 2021, by law, at least 1% of council budgets will be subject to participatory budgeting, directly involving the public in how money is spent. We don't believe that 1% is enough, but it's worth noting that it's more than the percentage of the Scottish budget that is allocated by any participatory budgeting. The sum at the moment is zero, and that's something I think the Scottish Government should consider doing in future. Presiding Officer, it's long past time, in our view, to increase the fiscal autonomy of local government, and that's why we're pleased to have secured longer-term reforms, including importantly, a commitment to a fiscal framework, a rules-based framework that provides clarity and predictability to the funding settlement, and hopefully will in future years take some, though not all, the political dynamics out of it. And so I was interested earlier this week to receive a letter from Gail McGregor, COSLA's spokesperson for resources, which I hope other parties have received, I'm sure they have, outlining COSLA's thinking about how this fiscal framework might operate. I was interested in particular to note a reference to Article 9 of the European Charter of Local Self-Government, as I'll shortly be introducing a Members' Bill to incorporate this into Scots law. Presiding Officer, if local government doesn't have the autonomy it needs, it can serve its citizens no better than if this Parliament does not have sufficient powers. And lack of agency, in turn, erodes trust between citizens and the local state. Presiding Officer, I don't feel comfortable sitting in this Parliament and voting on how much money local government should receive, but we are where we are, and we'll be supporting the order at decision time. Thank you.
Willie Rennie, 4 minutes, please.
I'm grateful to SPICE and the Financial Scrutiny Unit for giving us the detailed breakdown of the allocations to local authorities. I'm sure you'll remember, Deputy Presiding Officer, that for some time we've been debating these matters, in particular the shortfall that Aberdeenshire and Edinburgh got from the local government financial settlement. They didn't get anywhere near the grants of other local authorities. The SNP government pretended to listen. It enacted the 85% rule to make sure every local authority got at least 85% of the average. Yet that didn't work either, as councils like Aberdeen, Aberdeenshire and Edinburgh often still didn't meet the rule. Each council, not just now, each council was deprived of millions of pounds every year. It was not untypical for Aberdeen to lose out on £20 million in one financial year. Yet SNP MSPs from Aberdeen, like Kevin Stewart and Maureen Watt, still voted for it. To get round this embarrassment, ministers changed the rule. They did not increase the funding, but the rule based on the average of all councils in the country was changed to include all councils except Orkney, Shetland, Western Isles, Argyll and Bute, West Dunbartonshire and Inverclyde Council. So all the councils except not all the councils. But that still didn't quite work either. Taking out a fifth of the councils was not enough, so the government changed the formula again. The government lumped in council tax revenue on top of the government grant. And finally, the jiggery-pokery worked. All the councils met the rule, but without receiving one single penny more in funding. Edinburgh only just meets the 85% rule, even though they are still millions of pounds short. So this is the big question this afternoon. Will Ben McPherson stand up for his city in the way that Maureen Watt and Kevin Stewart did not? Will the Minister stand up for Edinburgh, or will his city get the same treatment as Aberdeen City? Not just now. Can he explain why he is shortchanging Edinburgh by this government's formula? It's worth £116 per person. That would amount to £60 million across the whole city. When you look at how the SNP Council in Edinburgh is cutting teachers and nursery schools and threatening support for community policing, you wonder why the government isn't taking this much more seriously. The council estimates that we'll have to make savings totalling £100 million by 2022-23. In Aberdeen City, they are used to this. They have been kept at the bottom of the table for a decade without their SNP MSPs lifting a finger to help. This year, it's the same again. They are £57 per person below a true 85% floor. That means the council is almost £13 million short. But back to Ben McPherson. What is he going to do this afternoon? Will he stand up for his government and its rigged formula, or will he stand up for his city? Thank you.
We now move to the open debate and speeches of 4 minutes, please. James Dornan, followed by Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to be given the opportunity to speak in today's debate, which thankfully comes at the end of our budgetary process. I'd like to put on record my sincere admiration for how Kate Forbes, our new Cabinet Secretary for Finance, along with her team, steered the government through the difficult budget negotiations. Sorry, I woke Richard up there. Securing an agreement which boasts support for young people, police, climate action and local government. Despite being set against the background of heightened uncertainty and risk created by the Tory government following their decision to delay the UK budget until only this week, the Scottish Government's budget provides local government with a substantial funding package worth £11.4 billion in total. And of course I know from my own local authority, Glasgow City Council, that local government does face its financial challenges, but so does central government, from continued Tory austerity and cuts to our budget. Chancellors, including the last one, Sajid Javid, who, by the way, never even managed to produce a single budget, promised an end to austerity in 2018 and again in 2019 and failed to deliver. I don't hold out any hope for an end to austerity tomorrow either, and to be honest, do any of you? Scotland's discretionary resource budget allocation in 2021 will be 2.8 or £840 million lower in real terms than it was in 2010-11, which obviously has a knock-on effect on central and local government finances. Our council budgets, nonetheless, are under considerably less pressure in Scotland than in England. But the Tories are in government, despite they want to hide it, because of the relative protection that we've been able to provide. This year's local government finance settlement, which delivers the highest annual revenue budget increase since this administration came into power, will boost day-to-day spending for local services by £590 million in cash terms, a real terms increase of 3.9%. The settlement will allow councils, like Glasgow City Council, to deliver on the expansion of free early learning and childcare provision, to protect the most vulnerable in our communities, ensure improved outcomes with the integration of health and social care services, and maintain the pupil-teacher ratio. And on that last point regarding teachers' numbers, Labour's budget in Glasgow would have cut 200 teachers from our schools, at a time when we are making huge progress in overcoming our poverty-related attainment challenges. As I've admitted, there are, of course, pressures in our finances, but whether it's central government or local government, Scottish Labour's priorities continue to be all wrong. Presiding Officer, despite our challenging financial situation, in addition to protecting our local councils, we remain in a position to protect our council taxpayers too. In 2019-20, the average charge for all property bands, including E, F, G and H, is between £330 and £499 lower in Scotland and England. The average band D council tax bill in Scotland this financial year is £1,251 compared to £1,750 in Tory-run England and £1,591 in Labour-run Wales. And furthermore, we're also able to maintain the UK's most competitive business rates regime. Would the member give way? Certainly I'll give way.
Quickly, please, Bob Doris.
I thank Mr Donlan for giving way. It's reasonable to ask for more money for local government, Mr Donlan, but in doing so you have to see where that money would come from. Did any of the parties on your committee suggest how much more councils should get and where that money would come from?
To be honest, it was a question...
Excuse me. First of all,
can
you speak through the chairs instead of
apologies,
having conversations with each other, even though you're so close at the moment. James Dornan.
Bob and I are always close, Presiding Officer. The reality is that question was asked of almost every witness that we had in front of us, and none of them could give a positive answer about how they'd be able to raise the money to make up for the extra costs that we're asking, and none of our members could come with a fully costed plan either. So, furthermore, we're also able to maintain the UK's most competitive business rates regime. This includes the lowest poundage and relief package, including the small business bonus and business growth accelerator, estimated by the Scottish Fiscal Commission to be worth £744 million. Scotland's poundage will be 49.8 pence, delivering a below-inflation increase for the second consecutive year. Limiting the increase to 1.6 will ensure that 95% of properties in Scotland pay a lower poundage than in other parts of the UK. And, Presiding Officer, before closing, I'd just like to add that our local councils will be key players in how, as a country, we can tackle the coronavirus outbreak. I therefore hope that in tomorrow's UK budget, we see additional resources to help us deal with such pressures and to end austerity. I'm sure we'll all be waiting with bated breath. As I've outlined, it's absolutely clear that despite ongoing pressures from Tory austerity, the Scottish Government continues to treat local government very fairly, enabling to provide high-quality frontline services that improve outcomes for people and communities right across Scotland. I'll be delighted to vote in favour for this finance order this evening.
Right. We're over time already in this debate. Unless others are very tight in their timing, I'm going to have to take it off the closing speeches. And I call Jeremy Balfour, followed by Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Deputy President Officer. I, along with my colleagues on this side of the chamber, will vote for this this evening later on. But I vote with it with a deeply heavy heart and with a lack of ambition by the Scottish Government. Because what we have seen not only in this financial settlement, but in previous financial settlements, is the clear lack of prioritisation by the SNP in regard to council funding. We have seen cuts, we have seen services affected, we have seen council taxes rise. And we, in a moment, we sit here and we quote figures at each other, figures which, to be honest, go beyond the average person. But let me give the Minister a real example of an individual within his constituency here in Edinburgh. This is what she wrote to me just earlier in this week. I am a parent of a child attending a primary school nursery here in Edinburgh. Our excellent nursery teacher does an incredible, valuable job of laying the foundations for school years and has my full support. I was shocked to hear that she will lose her post this summer, and I believe the removal of the teacher post will disrupt early years learning in the school and the development of our children next year. I wonder if the Minister, in his summing up, would apologise to this lady and the many others within this city that are losing teachers because of the settlement that he is bringing forward here. No, I won't. He said in his opening remarks that he thought this was a fair settlement. How is it fair for that child to lose their teacher? Now, he will stand up and say it's his SNP cronies up at the council who are making these decisions. But they're making these decisions because it's his government that is lacking the ambition for our children and our older people in city by cutting the funding to councils, not only here in Edinburgh, but across Scotland. And what the minister should do in his summing up is apologise to the people of Edinburgh for this shocking cut. Absolutely.
Bob Doris.
I'll make the same comment to the member, presiding officer, that I made to Mr Dornan. It's reasonable to ask for more money for councils, but you have to put a sum on that and you have to say where it's coming from. So could the member put a sum on that and say today where it's coming from?
James Balfour. Oh,
well,
sorry,
yet again, the SNP just don't simply understand what we're debating. We're not debating the budget today. That happened last week. We voted against your budget. You got the Boris bonus and you have simply misused it. You have not given the money to local government. And the people of Scotland are waking up to this. I feel all the shouting from the seats sums up a deep, uncomfortable feeling amongst the SNP benches about this.
There is no time for further interventions.
Deputy Presiding Officer, I conclude as I started. Yes, we will vote with this with a heavy heart. But the message that comes as we vote for this tonight is this government, this SNP party, don't care about local communities, don't care about local funding, and they're cutting local government, and they should be ashamed of that. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Call Rhoda Grant to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate focuses entirely on the work of local government and highlights that they've borne the brunt of cuts. We all know these cuts fall disproportionately on the poor and on women. As Sarah Boyack said, non-ring-fenced revenue funding has been cut by £898.8 million in real terms between 2013 and this budget. This is the money that councils use to react to differing circumstances in their areas, their discretional spend. They fund things like economic development and provide services that meet the needs of their communities. Presiding Officer, this shows councils have no discretion at all. Details of the impacts of those new cuts are only coming to the fore. Councils such as Murray are having to increase burial charges and charge for music tuition in schools. I fear soon that music tuition will only be available to those who can afford it, and that's to all our detriment. Murray are also cutting funding to Women's Aid. Falkirk Council is having to remove Christmas lights, close public toilets, and withdraw the taxi card budget. The taxi card helps people with disabilities who cannot use ordinary buses to travel in taxis at a reduced fare. These cuts show that the most vulnerable in our communities are losing out. One of the increasing issues in my post bag is the availability of assistance for children with additional support needs. And this is being cut. And at the same time, young people who require support are also losing out at school. These young people already face challenge, and that's being made worse by these cuts. Parents are unable to work because they're constantly on call for their child's school. And I've got cases where police are being called regularly to deal with distressed children. Other young people who are deemed less of a priority, despite being assessed as needing assistance, are receiving little or no support at school. Again, the most vulnerable being affected. Because of the underfunding of local government, community care also suffers. And this is despite the setting up of integrated joint boards, which appear to have not improved at all problems such as delayed discharge. They need investment, which is something our councils, in the face of cuts, cannot do. Some of the saddest cases are due to a lack of care at home. People being forced to live and die in hospital against their wishes and against their needs. These cuts drain the very compassion out of our societies. Councils are increasing council tax to the maximum, that the SNP will allow, and it was clear from the Minister's opening statement, this is an expectation, not a suggestion. People are frustrated by seeing services being cut by councils and their council tax increasing. This SNP government came into power promising to abolish the regressive council tax, yet over a decade later, they're still there and increasing faster than inflation. The Greens in last year's budget deal were promised talks about its abolition. These are ongoing but making no progress. Despite pleas for change, the only information the Scottish Government present to the cross-party talks are the impact of tinkering with bans and revaluation. This is not the work of a government committed to the abolition of the council tax. Presiding Officer, when our communities complain about rising council tax bills and falling services, it's not to their local councillors they should complain. Their complaints should be voiced to this SNP government. It is them who have imposed those cuts, and it is them who have imposed council tax rises. Councillors are merely doing the dirty work of this SNP government, a government that refuses to invest and is too timid to make real change.
The last of the open debate contributions is from John Mason.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Once again, we deal with another aspect of the budget, although I think in practice most of the decisions were made last week. The key points are that COSLA made it clear they needed an extra £95 million, and that has been found with the help of the Greens. In Glasgow, that seems to have been enough to save the Blair Vadich Outdoor Centre, which is obviously very welcome. But I'm sure we would all agree that local government could do with more money, and they are certainly asking for more money. The problem is that we have a fairly fixed amount of money available, and in fact, even that will not be entirely clear until after tomorrow's budget at Westminster. We might have been able to raise a little more income tax, but that would probably only have been marginal, and we made that decision last week. And as we said then, we cannot have too much divergence from the UK on income tax, and our powers over income tax are limited, while we have no control at all over VAT, corporation tax, inheritance tax, or national insurance. It makes it much more difficult to create a joined-up tax system when we have control over the few but not the many. This means that more money for local government would inevitably mean a cut to the NHS budget. I accept that the NHS has its budget better protected than most sectors have in recent years. However, we have to acknowledge that the health sector faces rising demand, greater expectations from the public, and particular uncertainty at this time. No sector has as much money as it could do with. So that means everyone has to do the best they can with the budget they have. It is maybe worth mentioning here that MSPs need to be careful about increasing their own budgets, for example for staffing, beyond inflation when others are not able to do so. As well as the size of the local government cake, there is the question as to how it is divided up between councils. Glasgow City Council feels it gets a raw deal as its needs are much more severe than other councils, and they feel this is not properly taken into account. But at the same time, other councils may and do argue that they get less per head, even if their needs are not so great. That formula and the related floor could perhaps be improved, but that would require agreement from COSLA and the local authorities, which is never likely to be easy. Yes?
Andy Whiteman.
I thank the member for taking an intervention. Does he agree with me that this formula, and it was referred to by the Liberal Democrats, by Mr Rennie, is agreed by the Scottish Government and COSLA, and the fact that there's no parliamentary scrutiny of it makes it very difficult to challenge some of these elements?
John Mason.
Well, I don't know the details, but I would have thought the Local Government Committee could have looked at the formula and investigated it, but I'm not sure if they've tried that or not been able to do that. But I think, everyone has said they're open to changing that formula, but the reality is, if Aberdeen is going to argue that they need more money because of the more people they've got, and Glasgow argues because of the need, it is difficult to reach an agreement. Anyway, there will also, I do agree, which I think would be Mr Whiteman's point, that we need a radical overhaul of local government financing. And that will involve deciding how local government should be funded in the longer term. Most of us would agree that council tax is far from ideal, but there seems to be no agreement as to what is better. Should it be local income tax, land valuation tax? They all have their drawbacks. Again, councils are being limited as to how much they can raise council tax, and some would think this is too restrictive. However, many of us remember the times when powers over tourist tax and workplace parking levy. I, for one, would certainly like to see local authorities being much more financially independent of central government than they are, and that could be built into a future Scottish constitution. However, that is more a hope for the medium to long term. Once again, we are having to choose, and that could be built into a future Scottish constitution. However, that is more a hope for the medium to long term. Once again, we are having to choose priorities, and all of us would like to give more.
Move to the closing speeches, and we're really tight for time, so Sarah Boyack, no more than 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I think today is a very short debate. And actually, we've discussed some of the key issues in previous weeks when we discussed the main budget debate. But I just want to highlight some of the briefings we've had in advance of today, because there hasn't been so much reference to them. I was grateful for the Unison briefing, for example, that was sent across, and I do hope that all members read it, because what they have been doing over the last few years is actually interviewing their members, looking at the pressures in local government, and picking up the point that cuts to local government impact on staff's capacity to deliver, because in addition to the pressures experienced by our communities, we have the pressure experienced by hard-working council staff who are trying to fill the service gaps to help constituents who are increasingly stressed and suffering from increased inequalities and ill health. And their most recent frontline briefing on social work vividly illustrated the impact on staff and the challenges that they have to deal with, and the impact on their health and the impact on absences. And that's something that has not come to the prominence in this debate, but is a key issue for our local authorities moving ahead. I do also want to acknowledge the work of my Labour colleagues in different council areas who are doing their best with the underfunding, which is not just a direct result of this year's budget, but since 2013. They have worked hard to say no to privatisation, no to compulsory redundancies, and make sure council staff are paid the living wage. And the other briefings that we've received over the last few weeks are from COSLA. Their arguments have been incredibly powerful, and they've not been addressed this afternoon, because right across local government services, they've highlighted the profound impact of underfunding, impact on education, on transport, on social care, and investing to deliver the climate transformation we need. In all of those areas, our local authorities are not just deliverers of services, but they're also key leaders in their area. They have the capacity to make the changes, but the underfunding is forcing them to go back to core services and not to do the range of services that are absolutely critical. The comments that my colleague Rhoda Grant made about women's aid, music tuition, there's a whole raft of councils now are beginning to charge for music tuition. Some already do that. Things like taxi card budgets. These are savings that will actually hit us in the long term, because it's meaning that young people are not getting the opportunities, the skills, the experiences that they should have. I want to turn briefly to the fiscal framework, I think mentioned by Andy Whiteman, who I thought in a very well-judged speech was actually quite honest that this is not the budget we need, it's the budget that's in front of us. We would have wanted it to be better, and that's why we don't think it's worth supporting today. The key principles in the fiscal framework should actually focus all of our minds. The parity of esteem, we haven't seen that. If we had parity of esteem, local authorities wouldn't be getting the 95 million, they'd be getting the other money to deliver the core services, to look at the real terms costs, to look at the presumption that recognising the importance of subsidiarity, the principle that devolution should go further than the Scottish Parliament, and that should be the norm. And that we should prioritise the principle of essential services at the core for the benefit of our communities. Would that this order delivered on these principles, because it is clear that it does not. And the thing that I would say to SNP colleagues in the chamber is that you need to do a harder job pushing your government, not just in public, but behind the scenes as well. I have to say, I don't have time in my closing remarks, having been on both sides of this chamber, I have experienced the pressure that's come from colleagues to make a difference in this chamber, and it's absolutely critical. And the comment about local government committee, we were taking evidence from a whole range of stakeholders, and a lot of people don't like criticising the government because the government provides the funds. And there's a key issue for us as MSPs. We have a privilege. We get to speak straight to the government, whether we're in government or whether we are in opposition, and we can say what the reality is. I hope the Scottish Government will reflect on what we've said today and think about that for future budgets. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Alexander Burnett, no more than 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I'd like to join my fellow colleagues Graham Simpson and Jeremy Balfour in our intent to support the motion today. But as pointed out, it's a technical motion that allows councils to receive their funding. So whilst we support the motion so that the annual process can happen, but only on the basis that it is to show our support for local authorities to receive proper and fair funding. However, as it has been said, this settlement for our local authorities is not fair, and we will continue to call for better funding for our struggling councils across Scotland.
Excuse me a minute, Mr Burnett. Mr Leo.
Just a second.
Please don't have your back to the chair.
Now, my colleague Graham Simpson made a good point that this is not a well-being budget for local government. For a Scottish government who spoke about how their budget would ensure the well-being of his country, I'm not sure how they thought reducing local government's total capital budgets in real terms by 30%, or nearly 335 million, is going to benefit the well-being of anyone. Yeah.
Bob Doris.
Thank you very much for giving way. Presiding Officer, opposition members have consistently called for more money for local government. That's a valid thing to do. But no opposition member has put a number on that or said where the money will come from. Will you be the exception and see where that money will actually come from, or is it just false promises?
Alexander Burnett.
Thank you. I think we've always made our point that if you focus more on growing the economy and raising revenue, then there would be more money to spend. If Scotland had had the same economic growth as the rest of the UK, it would be £500 million more that you could be putting into all services, whether it's local government or the NHS. Now, my colleague Jeremy Balfour made another valuable point in that we have a duty to ensure that the next generation and vulnerable people are being cared for, and more money from increased income would help that no end as well. Now, the rest of the debate has been relatively consensual in that most people all agree that the severity of the cuts that this order actually makes. Sarah Boyack has highlighted particularly the issues on ring fencing and passing of the decision-making of these cuts from Scottish Government to councils. Andy Whiteman and the Greens are maybe now wondering, does that money actually exist, and whether the 95 million actually exists on the order paper. And as a minister has been asked now 3 times in this debate to answer that, I hope he'll be able to in his closing remarks. Willie Rennie made an extremely valuable contribution and importantly highlighted how councils in the North East, such as Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire, are further shortchanged by this process under the funding formula. Yes, certainly.
Mike Rumbles.
I am genuinely puzzled why the Conservatives are supporting this order. It's not a good order. If you vote it down, all the government has to do is bring back a better order, and our constituents in the North East would benefit from that.
Alexander Burnett.
I appreciate his views on the process. However, our view is that if we don't support it, the councils will get nothing. But I do take on board the members' points. Now, James Dornan, as usual, well, he has plenty to say on Kate Forbes and even Sajid Javid, rather less on his colleague Derek Mackay, who actually wrote the budget. Now, Rhoda Grant touched on how these impacts are actually materialising from Murray, which will see increases in burial charges, and Falkirk, which will see cuts to women's aid. And John Mason also spoke, who feels that the 90 million satisfies COSLA's requirements, but unfortunately thinks that everything in this debate has been a choice between local government and the NHS. And as I pointed out earlier in response to an intervention, perhaps if more time was spent focusing on growing revenues through a growing economy, we might just have the answer. So in conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, we will be supporting the motion, but let it be known we are not happy about doing so. And like councils across the country, we are being pushed into a corner to make this decision. Thank you.
I now call on Ben McPherson to wind up this debate for up to 6 minutes. Please, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'll try and reflect on a number of points raised. But I think it's important, first of all, to just reiterate that this Local Government Finance Order 2020 that I'm seeking parliamentary approval to is to guarantee payment of £9.9 billion in revenue support to be paid to Scotland's 32 local authorities to enable them to provide the people of Scotland with the full range of services they expect and deserve. To come to some of the points raised, first of all, the quite reasonable point raised particularly by Andy Whiteman about the 95 million. Just for clarity, the figures presented for approval today do include the 95 million. The previous order that was laid was withdrawn and relayed on the 4th of March, and in Schedule 1 the 95 million pounds is included. So I hope that gives the clarity that was requested. There's 45 million in the revenue support grant in Schedule 1 of the order and 50 million in the non-domestic rate income in Schedule 1 of the order. Just to also, for clarity, a number of members raised the point around ring fencing. I think it's worth noting that local authorities have a complete autonomy to allocate over 91% or £10.4 billion of the funding provided by the Scottish Government, plus all locally raised income. Again, I'm quite pressed for time. Yes.
Andy Whiteman.
Very much thank the Minister. I mean, I hope he may write to me to clarify these points, because this order, the figures in it are exactly the same as the settlement letter of the 6th of February. So I mean, I've no doubt that this 95 million exists, but you can maybe write to me after today and clarify.
Given undertaking that it is, but I will write as soon as possible after this to just clarify that in writing with the member. The other point that was raised by a number of members was around the fiscal framework. Just for information, officials from the Scottish Government also will meet this week to continue to discuss that point. I thought Willie Rennie's contribution, apart from being quite personal, it's worth pointing out that the points he raised should be seen in context, that the overall local government settlement is distributed in full using the needs-based formula agreed with COSLA, as John Mason rightly pointed out, that the Scottish Government is open to consider any specific changes to the formula. However, any proposals must come through COSLA. I think that's the right forum for that to happen. No, thank you. No, thank you. I think it's also important, again,
Excuse me, Mr McPherson. Mr Day, will you stop having private conversations with your back to the chair? And Mr Rumbles, would you stop encouraging them all? Thanks very much. Ben McPherson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. You know, Jeremy Balfour, again, slightly personal, I thought, but of course raised a constituent inquiry, which is perfectly right and legitimate. I should just point out with regard to what he said that the settlement that the context of the settlement today includes ongoing funding of £88 million to maintain the pupil-teacher ratio, and in 2020-21 Edinburgh Council will have an additional £66.1 million or 8.8% compared with 2019-20. I would also just subtly point out that I don't need Jeremy Balfour to relay to me the fact that I need to take constituent concerns seriously. I mean, I've done 2 open advice surgeries in the last 4 days, which is more than the neighbouring member for Edinburgh Central has done in 4 years. Presiding Officer, today's order also distributes £9.9 billion, and this is not the whole story, as it does not cover the £709.7 million of specific revenue grants, which includes funding for early learning and childcare, criminal justice, the pupil equity funding, and additional support for Fairies. This represents real money for vital local services and should not be discounted when trying to make funding comparisons. This means that next year the Scottish Government will provide local authorities with a total funding package worth of £11.4 billion, delivering a real terms increase of 3.9% for vital day-to-day services for all councils. There is also further Scottish Government support of almost £580 million paid out with the local government finance settlement, and this includes the Attainment Scotland funds, Schools for the Future programme and City Deals, and is paid to local authorities, bringing the Scottish Government's total to over £12 billion. Presiding Officer, for context, despite Scotland's discretionary resource budget allocation being £840 million lower than it was in 2010-11, the Scottish Government has continued to protect Scotland's local authorities. The 2021 settlement will provide an increase of £589.4 million in local government day-to-day spending for local revenue services. Taken together with the potential to raise the council tax by 3%, in real terms, councils had the potential to spend around an extra £724.4 million in 2020-21. As Andy Whiteman pointed out, opposition members should note that failure to approve the order today would result in Scotland's local authorities and, as a consequence, all of our local communities being deprived of £589 million additional Scottish Government investment. So I'm grateful to both the Greens and the Conservatives for being responsible and stating that they will vote in support of this today. I encourage Parliament to support the local government finance order before us to ensure our local authorities can continue to deliver vital local services and finalise the significant funding package that will be provided by the Scottish Government. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
That concludes the debate on Local Government Finance Scotland Order 2020 in draft, and it's now time to move on to the next item of business. Give a moment or so for members to get themselves rearranged.
Thank you. Our next